And hello, Internet. This is Catherine Fitzsimmons, the owner of Brain Lag. Thank you for joining us for celebrating the release of Blackout Odyssey. And we have here with us the author. Introduce yourself, Victoria.
Hi, I'm Victoria Feistner, and I wrote Blackout Odyssey, which is a magical realism take on the Odyssey, but set in the 2003 Northeastern blackout, specifically in Toronto.
Excellent. So, you go into kind of the genesis of the book in the acknowledgments a little bit, but do you want to give us some more insight on how the story came to be?
The story came about. There were sort of two separate seeds. The first was watching the Coen Brothers movie, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" And it has like the title card. It's like this is based on the Odyssey. And since I'm a big Greek myth nerd, I got very excited. And so I watched the movie like trying to figure out what was what because I assumed it was going to be more overt than it was. I didn't realize it was extremely loosely based on the Odyssey. So I was already a little bit annoyed by the time that we got to Penelope. And I always find it annoying that, like, no matter what version of the Odyssey that happens, Penelope always gets the wrong end of the stick somehow. She's always doing her best with the shitty situation she's ended up with, but she's always somehow on the wrong side of it. Odysseus is always angry with her, no matter what she chooses. And we were talking about it afterwards, and a separate sort of thing happened where we realized like we had two friends who were fighting, and it was just sort of like they just need to use their words. Like this is one of those situations where if they just sat and talked to each other, we wouldn't be having this problem. And so it was sort of a combination of those. Like if Odysseus had talked to Penelope, he wouldn't have had the. Sorry, I'm just going to close the door.
No worries.
Can hear the TV from the peanut gallery. If Odysseus had just talked to Penelope, then it sort of would have gotten cleared up, but he sort of reacted first. And so that kind of became the theme of like how really the Odyssey is just a story of one guy who will not ask for directions, but also who just will not use his words in any situation. And it's always sort of classed as like he's so clever for getting out of it, but it's usually his asshole move that got him into it in the first place. And if you actually read the original, he's not a good guy. He's an asshole. And so the other thing that made me think about it is like, could I write something with a female protagonist who was sort of that level of not necessarily asshole, but like extremely self-assured and like talks herself into situations and then talks herself out without coming off as a complete asshole. And so that's kind of why I wanted to gender flip it, just to have that kind of, see if I could walk that tightrope, which I think I did. And that sort of just kicked around in my head for a little while until I decided to do NaNoWriMo in 2017. And it was like, I need an idea that I can do in 30 days. So that was the catalyst.
Very nice. So, do you want to talk a little bit about the parallels to the original Odyssey that you included in this?
Sure. They are, in a lot of cases, pretty subtle because I didn't want to break the flow of, I didn't want to create a suspension of disbelief problem. So a lot of the parallels are quite subtle and sometimes just come down to extremely bad puns and like layers of bad puns. So the rock battle that happens outside of Lee's palace is the two smashing rocks, the clashing rocks. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
two clashing rock bands. So that's that. And one of those bands is named uh, Cherbotis, I think. I don't know how to pronounce any of these things. I'm terrible at that, but I can spell it. And then the other one is the other band is called the Maytags, which is a joke because Maytag makes whirlpools, and the two things that they had to sail between the clashing rocks, and they also had to sail between Cherbotis, who was a monster that ate people, and a massive whirlpool. So it's just jokes like that. I'm sorry, I've got a cat who wants to come out now.
As they are wont to do. I like that.
That was not troubleshooted for.
So, okay, so you were only writing this since 2017.
2017, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the idea kind of came about much earlier.
That was a bit earlier. I don't remember exactly when it was that we watched the movie. I think it was maybe the year before, maybe. It might have only been the spring before. I can't quite remember. But I generally, like, if I get an idea for a novel and it kicks around, I usually have to write it before it'll get out of my head and I can write something else. Mm-hmm. So, or at least take a stab at writing it. And NaNoWriMo, of course, showed up. So it was just like, oh, I'll just get this idea out and then it'll be out of my head.
So how much reworking and editing did you have to do after NaNoWriMo?
Quite a bit, because I wrote it extremely out of order. I wrote the narrative chunks with Daniel Gabriel at the beginning and then in the middle. And then sort of used those as sort of the framework. And then I went back and I wrote some more, and the whole subplot with Dylan as Penelope, I didn't originally plan to include, but I felt like Penelope's story you had to show her side for it to be a complete argument. So I ended up writing all of Dylan's scenes separately in a separate document. And then when I was writing Mallory's scenes, I would get to a point in the plot where I felt like there was a natural break, and I would put square bracket, meanwhile back at the ranch, square bracket, and then keep going. And so in the editing process, I could just do a find for those square brackets and then figure out if it made sense to put the Dylan subplot in. So I don't know that there was a huge amount of rewriting, but there was definitely a lot of cutting and pasting and moving stuff around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am well familiar with writing a story out of order and then trying to piece it together.
Yeah.
So, what was the most challenging part of writing it?
The most challenging part of writing it for me was honestly research, because I tried to draw on places that I had been in 2003 as much as possible so that I could use my memories for them. But there were quite a lot of sort of connecting tissue places that I hadn't been in 2003. And I was researching this and trying to go through Toronto Star archive photos and stuff like that in 2017, 2018. And that's 15 years later. There's a lot of change that's gone on in Toronto since then. Mm-hmm. Even since 2017, I mean, Honest Ed's isn't there anymore, and quite a few locations aren't there anymore. So that was kind of the hardest part, because it was like, do I remember it this way? Do I write it as I remember it, which might be wrong? Or do I write it the way I can find pictures of it now, which may not be right either? It was kind of a bit of a... I do remember trying to set it in McCowan Station, and I'd never actually been to McCowan Station, but it made sense to set it there because it was the furthest east stop. So me and my partner went out one afternoon specifically to McCowan Station to take photographs, just to have a look, so I could sort of figure out where she'd be trying to get in, where the turnstiles, that sort of thing. And for people who don't know, McCowan Station is approximately this big, and it's right next to Scarborough Town Centre Station. Like, no one in their right mind would go to McCowan Station to get on the SRT when Scarborough Town Centre is right there, which is so much bigger. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I have to rewrite all of that then. So that section did take a little rewriting, but I'm glad I went out and clarified.
So what was the most fun part of writing the book?
The most fun part was just sort of the energy behind the scrapes that Mallory gets herself into, and figuring out fun ways to get out of them without relying too much on, sort of. I wanted her to get herself into the scrapes, but I also wanted her to get herself out of the scrapes. So I didn't want to rely too much on outside forces for stuff like that. Yeah, I think the most fun part to write was the whole scene with the Russians. And I know I've based them off of real people that I have known, but that's never happened to me. And I just want to formally apologize to the Russians of Toronto for that scene.
Well, we have a question in the chat from JD DeLuzio asking, how important is it to get the Toronto of that time right, given that there is a fantasy overlay to the actual Toronto, unless Toronto's really like that and we're just not noticing?
I wanted it to have that feel of it's set in a real place, but it has aspects that you haven't noticed. So you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I did allow for situations where it's like I can't go there anymore to check it out because it's not there, but it was there in 2003, and this is vaguely how I remember it. I tried to just sort of put in details that I remember enough that it feels like a real place, but may have fudged it just slightly. And if it comes out being different, it's because it's an alternate Toronto that is magical, and so a wizard did it.
Exactly.
Thanks.
And Pizza Cat Adventures asks, what are you planning to do in the future?
Oh, well, now that I've safely got Blackout Odyssey to bed and it's out in the world and I don't have to do quite as much work on it, I'm hoping to get back to, I've got a couple of other novels that I would like to put out on submission. So I'm hoping in the fall to start submitting. I've got a sci-fi novel that I'm hoping to start submitting. And I have another fantasy, a much more directly fantasy novel that I'd like to finish editing and get out, hopefully by the end of the year.
So it sounds like you really play up genres that you write in.
What do you mean?
Well, you've got Blackout Odyssey is a magical realism, I believe. Oh, nice cameo.
Yep, we've got a guest star. Oh, don't forget.
I believe your first book was general fiction?
My first book was general fiction. Blackout Odyssey, which is my 8th novel that I've finished, is magical realism. And I have... The other ones are sci-fi and fantasy. And then I have one that's more like a literary type novel that I'm working on now. So I read a lot of different genres. So I feel it's just sort of natural to write in a bunch of genres. Or sometimes put all of the genres in a blender and hit pulse a few times and see what comes out.
Why not?
Exactly.